All right, deep divers, get ready to dive into one of history's biggest mysteries.
Mysteries.
Well, that's what I always thought. We're talking about the Vatican secret archives.
Ah, yes. The Vatican Secret Archives, a place that definitely sounds like it's hiding something, right?
Exactly. It sounds like something straight out of a movie, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Secret chambers, hidden documents, maybe even a conspiracy or two.
It certainly has that air of intrigue.
But in reality, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Much more. And the real story is arguably even more fascinating.
So let's get right into it. What exactly are the Vatican secret archives? I mean, we've all heard the name, but what's really in there?
Well, they're essentially the central repository for all sorts of documents related to the Catholic Church, some dating back as far as the 8th century.
The 8th century. Wow, that's a lot of history.
It is. And it's not just, theological stuff. There are papal letters, state papers, trial records, even correspondence with some pretty famous historical figures.
So it's not just about religion then.
Not at all. It's a treasure trove of information about all sorts of things. Politics, art, culture, international relations, you name it.
Okay, so now I'm really intrigued.
Ah.
What are some of the most interesting things that are actually in there?
Well, one of the most famous items is a letter written on silk from a Chinese empress who converted to Christianity.
A silk letter. That's pretty impressive.
It is. It just goes to show the global reach of the church, even way back then. And then there's the record of Galileo's trial.
Oh, wow, Galileo. That's a big one.
It is. And the documents from the trial offer a fascinating glimpse into the clash between science and religion during the scientific revolution.
I can only imagine the debates that sparked. So where do we even begin to unpack all of this? It seems like every document has a story to tell.
You're absolutely right. But I think before we dive into any specific documents, we should probably address the big question. Why are they called the secret archives?
Yeah, because let's be honest, when I hear secret, I immediately think of something hidden. Like they're intentionally trying to keep things under wraps.
Right, but it's not quite like that.
So what's the deal with the name?
Well, the word secret in this context is actually more of a historical quirk than anything else. It comes from the Latin word secretum, which means private. So think of it more like a personal archive, like someone's private diary, but on a much grander scale.
Okay, so not necessarily top secret government files then.
Not exactly. Although some of the documents do deal with sensitive matters, the term secret really just refers to the fact that these were originally the private archives of the Pope.
So kind of like a papal diary then.
Exactly. But here's the thing. These archives aren't so secret anymore.
Really?
Yeah. Back in the late 19th century, Pope Leo XIII decided to open the archives to scholars for research.
Wait, so people can actually go in there and read these documents?
They can. Of course, there's a process and certain restrictions, but for the most part, these archives are now accessible to researchers from all over the world.
That's amazing. So they're not just sitting there gathering dust.
Not at all. They're a living, breathing archive, constantly being studied and reinterpreted.
So how did this incredible collection even come about? Did the Vatican secret archives just appear one day, fully formed?
Oh, not quite. The story of the archives is really a fascinating journey that mirrors the evolution of the church itself. Imagine the very early days of Christianity, a time of both growth and persecution.
I can only imagine. It must have been a very different world back then.
It was, and during those early days, leaders needed a way to keep track of everything. Missionary work, theological debates, even just basic administrative stuff.
Right, because even in those early days, there must have been a lot to keep track of.
Absolutely. And so these early records were really crucial for maintaining a sense of continuity and identity within the church.
It makes you wonder what those earliest documents would say, doesn't it?
It does. What would it be like to read firsthand accounts from the very beginnings of Christianity? Sadly, a lot of those early records were lost, especially during periods of persecution.
Oh, right, because early Christians weren't always treated very well, were they?
Definitely not. In fact, there was one Roman emperor, Diocletian, who specifically targeted Christian writings for destruction.
What a loss. To think of all that history, gone forever.
It is a tragedy, but thankfully, some documents did survive. And as the church grew, they realized they needed a more organized system for keeping all these records safe.
So what did they do?
Well, that's where the scrinium comes in. It was essentially the central filing system for the early church, located in the Lateran Palace in Rome.
Hold on, the Lateran Palace. I thought we were talking about the Vatican.
We are, but the archives weren't always located in the Vatican. They actually had a pretty nomadic existence for a while.
Really? Nomadic, they moved around.
They did. They were moved to the Vatican under Pope Innocent III in the 13th century, likely for reasons of security and administrative efficiency.
Okay, so once they got to the Vatican, they stayed put, right?
If only it were that simple. They actually followed the papacy on its travels, even relocating to Avignon, France during the 14th century.
Wait, so they packed up all these important documents and moved them across Europe?
Yep. Imagine transporting all those fragile parchments and scrolls in a time before climate-controlled trucks.
Talk about a logistical nightmare. And then to top it all off, you mentioned the Western Schism. Wasn't that a time when there were multiple people claiming to be the Pope?
It was. And just to make things even more complicated, during the schism, we ended up with multiple sets of archives, each reflecting the different papal courts.
So not only were they moving the archives around, but they also had multiple copies of some documents.
Exactly. It was a bit of a mess, to say the least.
I can only imagine. So how did they eventually get everything back together?
It was a long and gradual process, but once the schism ended, there was a movement to consolidate all the records back in the Vatican. It took centuries to really get everything organized, but eventually they did it.
Talk about an archival puzzle. But all this moving and sorting must have really highlighted just how valuable this collection was, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about keeping track of internal church matters anymore. It was about preserving a record of European history as seen through the lens of the papacy.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. So we're talking about more than just religious history here. This is global history.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Vatican Secret Archives so fascinating. They're a window into some of the most pivotal moments in human history. It's incredible to think about the sheer volume of information they contain and how meticulously it's all organized.
Well, that's good to hear because I was just imagining endless rows of dusty shelves with no rhyme or reason.
Oh, no, not at all. They have a very sophisticated system for classifying and cataloging everything.
Okay, so walk me through it. How exactly are the Vatican Secret Archives organized?
Well, one of the most important collections, as we touched on earlier, is the papal registers. These are essentially copies of official letters sent out by the popes.
So it's not just decrees and pronouncements, but a real glimpse into the day-to-day business of running the church, right?
Precisely. And you can see how their concerns and priorities shifted over time as you move through the different series of registers.
Okay, so how are those registers organized? By pope? By topic? What's the system?
Well, they're grouped into different series based on both time periods and locations. For example, they have the Vatican registers, which are a really important source for understanding European history, especially for the 13th and 14th centuries.
Wow, that's pretty specific, the 13th and 14th centuries. Why those centuries in particular?
Well, that's when these registers become more or less continuous. You have a few volumes from earlier centuries like the 9th and 11th, but it's really in the 13th century that they start keeping consistent records.
So it's like having a direct line to the popes who were shaping Europe during those turbulent times.
Exactly. And then you have the Avignon registers, which covered that fascinating period when the papacy was located in Avignon, France.
Ah, yes, the Avignon papacy. That was a pretty wild time in church history, right? With all those competing claims to the papal throne.
It was. And these registers offer a really unique perspective on that whole era.
So those registers are like a time capsule, each one offering a glimpse into a specific period of church history.
You could say that. And then you have other series, like the Lateran registers, which cover a much broader period from the late 14th century to the late 19th.
Wow, that's a long stretch. So we're talking about centuries of papal correspondence.
We are. And it's not just the registers. There are also archives from all the different departments of the Roman Curia.
The Roman Curia, that's the administrative heart of the church, right?
It is. Think of it like the Vatican's version of a government bureaucracy.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a sense of just how vast these archives really are.
Oh, we're just scratching the surface. I mean, we haven't even touched on the Secretariat of State archives.
The Secretary of State? What's that?
That's where they kept all the records related to the papacy's dealings with other countries. So you'll find diplomatic correspondence, treaties, reports on political situations all over the world.
That sounds fascinating. Imagine reading those dispatches and seeing how the popes navigated the world of international politics.
It really gives you a sense of the papacy's influence on a global scale. And remember, it's not just limited to Europe. We already mentioned that letter from the Chinese Empress.
Right, so we really are talking about a global perspective here.
Absolutely. The Vatican Secret Archives truly reflect the interconnectedness of the world, even centuries ago. And it's not just official records and high-level politics either.
Okay, so what else is in there?
Well, they have personal collections from families, religious orders, even prisoner of war records from both world wars.
Prisoner of war records. That's unexpected.
It is, but the Vatican played a role in trying to locate missing soldiers and facilitate communication between prisoners and their families during the wars.
Wow, I never would have guessed that. So, amongst all these official pronouncements and diplomatic dispatches, you've also got these incredibly personal stories. It's amazing how much history is contained within those walls.
It really is. And some of the most captivating documents are those that offer a glimpse into individual lives and experiences. Take, for example, the records from the trial of Galileo.
Oh, right. We talked about Galileo earlier, the scientist who dared to challenge the church's view of the universe.
Exactly. And reading the actual documents from the trial is an incredible experience. You see the accusations laid out against him, his attempts to defend himself, the church's reasoning for condemning his ideas.
It must be fascinating to see how those ideas were debated and contested at that time. Did they have any clue how groundbreaking Galileo's work would turn out to be?
Probably not. But it's a powerful reminder of how new ideas, especially ones that challenge long-held beliefs, can often be met with resistance.
It makes you think about what other groundbreaking ideas might be hidden within those archives.
Absolutely. Then there's that appeal from those English figures regarding Henry VIII's desire for an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon.
Ah, yes. Henry VIII, another major historical figure who clashed with the church. And this document played a key role in that whole drama, didn't it?
It did. And it's incredible to see those signatures, those names from history on that one piece of paper. It really brings it all to life.
It's like holding a piece of history in your hands. And that one document set off a chain of events that led to the creation of the Church of England.
Talk about a ripple effect. And speaking of ripple effects, there's that fascinating letter written on silk from Empress Helena of China to Pope Innocent X.
Right, the Chinese empress who converted to Christianity. It's amazing to think that a document like that exists. It really speaks to the global impact of the church, even back then.
It does. And then there's the document that details Queen Christina of Sweden's abdication in 1654.
Queen Christina, why did she abdicate?
Well, she actually converted to Catholicism and decided to give up her throne. And this document, signed by hundreds of members of the Swedish parliament, confirms that decision.
Wow, that's quite a story. To give up your throne for your faith. It makes you wonder what was going through her mind. What led her to make such a dramatic choice?
It's something historians are still trying to understand, but it just shows you the power of belief and the impact it can have on individual lives.
It's incredible to think about all these stories, all these threads of history converging in one place.
Exactly. And the Vatican Secret Archives are not just about the big names and the major events. There are countless stories of ordinary people woven into those documents as well.
It's like a giant tapestry of human experience spanning centuries and continents. But let's shift gears for a moment. We've talked a lot about the past, but what about the present and future of the archives? How are they being preserved for future generations? And how are they being made accessible to researchers and even the public?
That's a great question. The Vatican Secret Archives are not just a static collection of old documents. They're a living archive, constantly being cared for and studied.
So what kind of steps are they taking to ensure these fragile pieces of history are protected?
Well, for starters, they have a whole department dedicated to preservation and restoration. They have climate-controlled vaults to protect the documents from humidity and light damage. And they use all sorts of high-tech methods to repair and conserve them.
That makes sense. Some of these documents are incredibly old and delicate. Right.
They are. I mean, think about it. We're talking about parchment and papyrus, some of which are over 1,000 years old.
Wow, that's mind-boggling. So how do they even begin to address all the potential problems those materials face?
It's a constant effort. But they've got experts who are trained in all the latest techniques, from traditional bookbinding to cutting-edge digital imaging.
I see. So it's a blend of old and new approaches.
Exactly. And they're constantly researching and developing new methods to ensure these documents are preserved for generations to come.
Now, I have to ask, can anyone just walk in and see these documents?
Well, not exactly. Access for researchers is carefully controlled, and they have to go through a pretty rigorous application process. But they do occasionally hold exhibitions where they showcase some of their most important pieces.
I bet those are popular. But what about for people who can't make it to Rome? Is there any way for them to see these treasures?
They've actually been working hard to digitize a lot of the collection.
So people can view them online.
Exactly. They have online exhibitions, virtual tours, and they're even making high-resolution images available to researchers all over the world.
Wow, that's incredible. So technology is playing a big role in making these archives more accessible to everyone.
It absolutely is. And it's not just about access either. Technology is also transforming the way researchers can study these documents.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
Well, for example, they're using 3D scanning and multispectral imaging to examine documents in ways that were never before possible.
Those sound pretty high tech. Break it down for me. What exactly do those techniques do?
Well, 3D scanning allows them to create incredibly detailed digital models of the documents.
So you can see every little detail, even the texture of the parchment.
Exactly. And it's great for preserving fragile documents because you don't have to physically handle them. Then you have multispectral imaging.
Okay, and what does that do?
It uses different wavelengths of light to reveal things that are invisible to the naked eye. For example, you can sometimes recover faded text, even see through layers of overwriting.
Wow, that's like having X-ray vision for old documents.
Pretty much. It's really amazing what they can do with these new technologies.
It sounds like a whole new chapter is unfolding in the history of the Vatican's secret archives, and technology is leading the way.
It is, and the Vatican is really at the forefront of all this. They have a dedicated school for training new generations of archivists and historians in these cutting-edge techniques.
That's really cool. What's the school called?
It's called the School of Paleography and Diplomatics.
Paleography and Diplomatics. Those sound like subjects straight out of Hogwarts.
Maybe. But they're basically the study of old handwriting and historical documents.
So they're training a whole new generation of historical detectives, equipping them with the tools to uncover the secrets of the past.
Precisely. And these graduates go on to work in archives and libraries all over the world, so the impact of this school is far-reaching.
It's inspiring to think that the Vatican's secret archives are not just about preserving the past, but also about shaping the future of historical research.
Absolutely. And it's not just about technology either. It's about the collaboration between scientists, historians, archivists, all sorts of experts.
It takes a village to unlock the secrets of history, it seems.
It really does. And the Vatican Secret Archives, with its vast collection and its forward-thinking approach, is the perfect place for that kind of collaboration to flourish.
It really makes you wonder what other historical mysteries are still out there, just waiting to be solved with these incredible tools.
Oh, I'm sure there are countless stories waiting to be discovered. And the Vatican Secret Archives, with its vast collection and dedication to using these new technologies, is really at the forefront of this whole digital revolution in historical research.
It is pretty amazing to think about. So after this deep dive into the world of the Vatican Secret Archives, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these archives aren't some kind of, static monument to the past. They're dynamic, they're constantly evolving, and they continue to shape how we understand not just the past, but also the present and even the future.
It's a good reminder that history is never really settled, is it? It's always being reinterpreted and rewritten as new information comes to light.
Exactly. And the Vatican Secret Archives, with its commitment to research, preservation, and public access, is really playing a crucial role in keeping that conversation between the past and the present alive and well.
Now, before we wrap up, I have to ask, if you could pick just one document, any document, to examine from the Vatican Secret Archives, what would it be?
Ooh, that is a tough one. There are so many incredible choices, but I think if I had to pick just one, I'd go with the Liber Diurnus Romanorum Pontificum.
The Liber Diurnus. Remind me what that one's about again.
It's basically a collection of formulas and models for papal documents from the early church, kind of like a handbook for how things were done back then.
Oh, right. So you could see how the early church operated, how they structured their administration, all that kind of stuff.
Precisely. I think it would be fascinating to trace how those early administrative and legal practices developed over time. And you get a glimpse into the minds of those early church leaders, see how they thought about things.
It'd be like a behind-the-scenes tour of the early church.
Exactly. And it would be really interesting to compare those early practices with how the church operates today to see what's changed and what stayed the same across the centuries.
Now, that is a fascinating thought. It just goes to show that even in a place as ancient and seemingly unchanging as the Vatican, there's always something new to learn, something that can surprise you and challenge your assumptions.
That's the beauty of history, isn't it? There's always more to uncover, more to understand. And who knows what secrets are still waiting to be revealed within the walls of the Vatican secret archives.
Well, after this deep dive, I think it's safe to say we've officially cracked the code of the Vatican Secret Archives. And to our listeners, if you ever find yourselves in Rome, be sure to add it to your itinerary. You might just stumble upon a piece of history that changes how you see the world.
And even if you can't make it to Rome, remember that so much of this incredible collection is now accessible online. So go explore, dive in. The secrets of the past are waiting for you.
That's right. And who knows, maybe one of you will make the next big discovery. Until then, happy diving.